The Mechanic's Companion, or The Elements and Practice of Carpentry, Joinery, Bricklaying, Masonry, Slating, Plastering, Painting, Smithing, and Turning, comprehending the latest improvements and containing a full description of the tools belonging to each branch of business, with copious directions for their use and an explanation of the terms used in each art. Also an introduction to practical geometry is a 19th century text by Mighty Nicholson, where he talks about various trades and tools of the era, the least of which not being a very distinct workbench that features aprons, a bunch of holes, and a massive face vise, among other things. Now, Nicholson didn't invent the bench that he talks about in this book, but by putting it down in writing, he became the bench. The Nicholson workbench, also known as the English joiner's bench, is the style of workbench I'm going to be building. Have built. I haven't gone back in time to build it yet, but once I do, I'll do a more thorough explanation of my experience using the bench and make any adjustments if necessary. Now, I say style because there are some distinct differences between this bench and a classic Nicholson. Most notably is that this is a vise-less workbench, a variant I like to call the Mighty Nicholson. Now, when constructing a workbench, there are a few sometimes debated rules to consider. The first of which is that you want to make your bench as massive as possible. A bench can be too light, but it can't be too massive. Beefing up the legs is one way to do this. This is mostly a structural preference, though, and aesthetic. Because, I mean, come on. Why have this when you could have this? The last thing you want is a bench that's going to be hopping around your shop when you have some heavy planing or chiseling to do. The more massive your bench, the more massive the work it can take. I try and wipe up the squeeze out while the glue is still sopping wet, but sometimes you just can't get it all. The working side of the legs will need to be flat and flush with the bench's apron to form a 90-degree angle to the bench's top. Now, unless you intend on using the opposing side of the bench as a working side as well, flatness on that apron doesn't really matter. A quick note on bench height. This will vary depending on your needs. If you're doing more sawing and detail work, you generally want a higher bench. If you're doing more hand planing, then you want a lower bench to maximize leverage. If you're unsure, a good height would be up to your knuckles if your arms are relaxed by your sides. These leg assemblies will be held together by a few cross braces that will need some notches to seat into. Let's give the carcass saw a try. Wait, why did I do that? Oh, right, to remove mass. After all, we want to make these benches as light as possible. Psych! Think fast. Hold fast. Vices aren't to be trusted. Well, some of them. The holdfast isn't better than the vise, it's just different. Really, they're just made for violent, destructive people that like swinging hammers around. The thing about them is, they can get a little picky about their holes. Too deep or too shallow, and they can't get a good grip. I made the mistake of buying a set of poorly designed holdfasts off eBay that were too sensitive about hole depth to be practical. I would later pick up a quality set of Gramercy Tools holdfasts, but not before making a bunch of modifications to my bench like this one. Moral of the story, don't skimp out on quality holdfasts. These leg holes are just a preamble to many, many more holes that will be added to the rest of the bench. It's easy to get them in now before everything is assembled. The holes on the legs are close together. You want to have fairly fine adjustment tolerances because working at the proper height for planing and sawing and whatever else the kids are doing with their wood these days makes all the difference. Another one of those workbench rules has to do with depth/width of the bench and is among the more subjective of the workbench rules. A workbench can be too wide, but it can also be too narrow. Nicholson calls for a width of 30 inches, but anything between 24 and 36 would do just fine. A bench that isn't wide enough starts to run the risk of being too small to comfortably work on, or even becoming unstable. Too wide, and you can no longer use bar clamps across the surface. If something is out of reach, then you waste time walking around your bench to get to it. A wide surface is great for a table dedicated to glue-ups and assembly, but not so much for a bench like this. Some people get all fancy with attaching these things. Some people literally just glue and screw them together with fasteners, which is a fancy word for screws. If you do use screws, just don't ram into them with a hand plane on accident. I'm adding dowels after everything dries for reinforcement, I guess. And then leveling this plane of existence with an existing plane of mine. Apron wood and for top wood. The next order of business is adding some cross braces. These will help to make the bench feel more like a butcher's block and less like a trampoline. The infamous dovetail joint is implemented, as it's the most mechanically sound. The cut doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to look good on camera. As you can see, even an unfinished bench is a useful bench. The edges need to be flattened and squared up so we can glue these panels together. I threw these panel clamps together a little while back out of some junk from the hardware store, and my only regret is not having more money at the time to buy more hardware to make more of them. Imagine a workbench that's 75 miles long. Pretty cool if you think about it. Now, given a long enough workshop, this would be totally acceptable in the landscape of workbench ethics, because a bench can be too short, but a bench cannot be too long. This bench is 9 feet in length. It's the most I could fit in my shop. I think long benches are cool as fuck. Benches of old were even longer. In Nicholson's text, he recommends that a bench be at least 10 to 12 feet in length. The top panels are fastened to the cross braces with carriage bolts. These are countersunk to avoid risk of ramming a hand plane or some other hapless tool into them. Now, I didn't have access to long enough bolts at the time, so I needed to countersink the bottom of the cross braces so my shorter bolts would fit. That being said, drilling them all the way through is a mistake. If there's a big old hole down there already, you're going to have problems lining up your Forstner bit.
It's perfect.
The right thing to do is to drill down just so the tip is barely poking through. This gives you much better reference for your Forstner bit. Once the top panels are secured, it's time to flatten. The top panels were cut a little proud of the apron so they could be plain flush with the apron. Here's another one of those touchy subjects, and you guessed it, it's about holes. They say you shouldn't add too many because it can be labor intensive to add holes, and chances are you won't use them all very much. So I'm starting off with a reasonable amount, and we'll go from there. Remember this? Well, this is kind of like that, but not. The surface is too thin for my shitty eBay holdfast to bite into, so we're using blocks to add thickness where the holes are. It's not the prettiest thing in the world, but hey, no one will know they're there except for me. These craters are reserved for a pair of Lee Valley aluminum diving board planing stops. They have a tricky profile. The original Nicholson bench design calls for a wooden plane stop called a bench hook that would snake its way up the leg and pop its way out the top. This would be a fine alternative.
The crochet is a planing stop for the vertical face of the bench. Now, if you ask me, it looks more like a crotch than a crochet, but what do I know?
The last thing to do is to construct a center rail. This is made from the straightest top plank cutoff. Firstly, it needs to fit between the two top panels, so a planing is in order. Nextly, we need to cut out some notches for the center rail to nest into the cross braces. Once it fits, we scrub it down. Let's get boring. Okay, that's enough of that. These cavities will act as tool holders. It's a great way to keep unused tools out of your work area. Hard coatings like shellac or urethane will make a surface too smooth, causing your workpiece to slide around. You also run the risk of marring your workpiece. So I'm finishing this thing with good old-fashioned boiled linseed oil. Okay, it's been 3 or 6 months since I built this thing, and I think I've pretty much put it through its paces. There's still a few kinks to work out, but here's my initial take.
I love it.
I was really curious about this vise-less variant that's had a recent rise in popularity. Now, although holdfasts have been around for at least 2,000 years, they're not actually mentioned in Nicholson's text. So this build's a little off the beaten path in that regard, but it isn't without its advantages. Vices can be fiddly and take time to wind and unwind, but with the holdfast, fixing stock to a surface is as quick as a hammer strike. The holdfast can be used in tandem with a multitude of simple jigs. This board is called a doze foot. It secures stock against the planing stop to eliminate movement when planing. You can use battens to secure boards to the vertical face of the bench as well. To be honest, I was really surprised at how well this system works. The center rail is robust in its ability to store tools, sneak in bar clamps, or act as an effective planing stop. And of course, there's the surface area. I'm a big fan of surface area. Now, like I said, there's a few minor issues to fix before we put this build to rest. For one, the surface has continued to warp with seasonal changes and will need to be reflattened. But this is pretty standard for any bench. This means much larger, inconsistent gaps between the center rail and the two surface panels. It's not a big deal for functionality, it just looks sloppy. The gap in the center rail is 3/4 of an inch wide, and in hindsight, I should have gone more narrow, like 5/8, as many of my tools are too small for it and they just fall through. The last straw for the eBay holdfasts was when they started to deform holes that got a lot of use. So I bit the bullet and got a set of Gramercy Tools holdfasts I mentioned earlier, and I haven't looked back. For a workbench that capitalizes on the utility of the holdfast, you really need a lot of holes. The more holes you have, the more work holding solutions you have. So I'm adding more. And of course, another coat of boiled linseed oil never hurt anyone. And that's it. The Mighty Nicholson is a cost-effective woodworking workbench that's relatively simple to make. And despite this, if it's properly cared for, it'll outlive all of us. Now, there are good benches and there are bad benches, but there is no perfect workbench. I can't tell you whether or not this is the right workbench for you, because the workbench is a very personal tool, and different variants suit different needs. But if you are interested in building this bench yourself, I've made detailed plans available on my website for purchase. If you like using hand tools, there's no substitute for a proper workbench. The budget-conscious woodworker can't go wrong with the Nicholson-style bench. It requires a fraction of the amount of wood needed for a comparable slab-style bench, like a rouleau or a shaker, nor are you required to invest in expensive vices up front. If you're reluctant to go vise-less, I encourage you to be open-minded about trying something new. You might be pleasantly surprised. A bench like this is basically a blank canvas for all sorts of add-ons. So, worst case scenario, you can always just add on one on when you're ready. Though I've had a lot of fun designing and building this bench, I've had even more fun using it. It seems the bench now plays a critical role in everything I make, which leads me to wonder, how did I ever get along without it? And done. Well, I guess the only thing left for me to do now is some more shameless plugging. Hey, I gotta do something to keep the lights on. There are detailed plans and instructions available for this bench on my website. This includes dimensions and measurements for sizes ranging from 6 to 10 feet in length, step-by-step assembly instructions, and even more video content for a more thorough walkthrough. So check it out if you think this bench suits your fancy. And of course, don't forget to declare a thumb war, submit to my channel, and ring that motherfucking bell. And now that all that's out of the way, thanks for sticking around this long. Thank you for watching and for all the encouragement and kind words that's been said on the past few videos. I know this is the most played out phrase in YouTube, but it really does mean a lot, and it really helps to keep me going. I promise the next video won't take over a year to upload. It's coming soon, so keep your eyes open. Until then, I'll see you next time.